It's on the cloud, I think. Yeah. So, oh, sorry, just before, let me just pause the recording. Hello, my name is Roger Casali from Europeans, and I'm with Emeritus Professor Juliet Lodge. Juliet, hello, thank you for being with us.
Hi, good to see you.
Juliet, you were European Women of the Year in 1992. I know this because I was doing my master's at the time in European Affairs, reading your book, and it said so on the back cover, and I thought, that's somebody I'd like to meet. That's a woman to look up to. How did it feel to win European Woman of the Year in 1992?
Well, the first thing was it was a massive shock because I had no idea there was any such thing, any such awards of any such nature. And I think the biggest thing that was very striking was that as a Brit at a time when the British government was vacillating about Europe and having some very difficult conversations, it was very odd to be a Brit who'd been given this award for what had turned out to be voluntary work I'd been doing in talking about things European and why the single market was going to be a very good idea to voluntary sectors, to everybody outside academia, and having very interesting conversations about what the opportunities were. And one could have exactly the same conversations now, which is what is really quite shocking, about what we're losing as a result of what's happened in Britain.
I don't know if you were still on the same platform as Margaret Thatcher in 1992, but in 1987 you must have been. She was a great advocate of the single market.
Yes, she was. And at that time, one of the things that the British were talking about all the time was one mustn't constrain sovereignty and sovereignty this and sovereignty that. And they refused to talk about things like legal convergence, getting lawyers together, getting judges together, getting the police together within some kind of treaty framework. And at the same time, they wanted to have European activity to combat terrorism. And so part of my research at that time was on security dimensions of what was going on in Europe. And we kept pressing this idea that, in fact, if you're going to have freedom of movement, and just assuming it's a few tins and crates and trucks crossing the channel was absolutely ludicrous. It made no sense whatsoever because anything moves. And it transpired that in the end, everything did move, body parts, corrupt practices, things you could see, things you couldn't see, bad people, good people, everything. And it took some time for that to sink into the minds of, shall we say, the political masters compared to, say, the civil servants, the people on the ground who had to deal with the pragmatics of freedom of movement.
That was quite a challenge, and as you've described it, an unexpected challenge at the time. How did Europe rise to the challenge? What happened next?
Well, we have to go back and think that there was a group of MEPs who formed the Kangaroo Group, and a group within the Benelux countries and the original founders of the European Union who were very open to the idea that if you're going to have a single market and you're going to abolish the internal geographical physical borders, that perhaps one needed to create a cluster of countries who were going to try this out. And that's in fact what happened. You had a cluster within what was then an EU of 9 states, then 12 states, and then 15 as we got the Scandinavian countries joining, and Austria as a neutral country, who said, well, let's dare think about what this could actually mean, and who took the first steps. And then everybody looked at what the evidence was, saw that this was working in good ways and could see ways in which to improve it, and eventually decided, yes, we'll move along these lines. We want to join in this. And so it was very incremental, very, very pragmatic, and eventually led to people saying, well, sovereignty didn't make sense unless it was pooled. And so you got the creation of Europol, Eurodac and everything, all those kinds of things at a time when one wasn't talking about a common asylum policy or a common juridical or judicial system to exchange information, or even a common visa system. Those things were not on the agenda.
Some of those kangaroos, the MEPs who were part of the kangaroo group, as you called it, would have been British kangaroos, wouldn't they? British MEPs. Who were they?
Yes, you had the British MEPs have been extraordinarily influential, I think, in Europe in the way in which they changed the way the European Parliament worked, because when the EC was first formed, it was nothing but a consultative chamber which could be ignored. By 1992, it was getting real legislative power, a right to be heard and a right to be consulted, even if it didn't have the final say on legislation. And it got a right of initiative and had the right to say no to the budget, not pass the budget. But the Brits introduced things like question time. They introduced all kinds of standing committees and ideas, which were, again, informed by the practicalities of actually having an accountable democracy, a parliamentary responsibility, an executive council and commission working together and being directly accountable to the European Parliament, which was only first elected in 1979. So it was a nascent parliament with MEPs who were not has-beens and who were beginning to make a career for themselves in Europe and seeing that Europe could be developed into something that could be a force for good at the time when we had the war in Yugoslavia. And at a time where people were saying, well, let's make this concept of European citizenship and this idea of freedom of movement really tangible for people in a way that's going to be beneficial to them.
One of the MEPs, I remember the 1990s, my MEP was absolutely wonderful, called Anita Pollack, fantastic MEP. And she had a very close association with another great European woman who actually didn't start out as a very pro-European, but ended up very pro-European, Barbara Castle, trying to get rights into social rights into Europe. People often forget, don't they, Juliet? And you've described it now very, very well, that Britain hasn't just been a taker from Europe. Britain has been a giver. There are many, we're talking about them now, many often very practical ideas, very pragmatic ideas. I mean, even we said it, even Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s had the idea of taking away these non-tariff barriers that are all going to be coming back again in the next few weeks. It's underestimated, isn't it? And freedom of movement was part of that, wasn't it? Part of that idea to, as you described, to make
very much so.
Make our lives simpler. It's not an ideology, freedom of movement, is it? It's
about
making life simpler for people.
Well, if we go back, Roger, if we go back to before the single market was actually the glimmer of a reality, you would have trucks standing in the ports with 14 sheets of paper filling out bureaucratic forms. And I can remember they called this document the single administrative document, the SAD document, and kept saying, wouldn't it be great if we could replace that with one or none? And that was a hugely pragmatic step. But at the same time, you also had, particularly in the Labour Party, where there'd been a lot of scepticism around Europe, you have people like David Martin in Scotland, Richard Corbett in Yorkshire and Humberside. You had MPs of both parties being willing to think about the ways in which they were going to make this work. And they would have difficult conversations, and there would be all this argument about, do we have subsidiarity, and what does confederation mean, and is it a federal state? All the things that have been thrown up in the air again. But they would look at it and say, well, how do we make Europe work for people? Because it's people who are going to shape the future. It's not just about trade, and it is getting mutual recognition of qualifications. It is making sure that young people in particular are able to take advantage of mobility when you get rid of passport barriers and all the paraphernalia that attended paper-based visa systems, getting different currencies every time you wanted to travel anywhere, rather than being able to hop onto a boat or a plane without any real preparation.
So in a way, we've gone full circle. I mean, we're seeing these images. I know it's to do with COVID at the moment, but soon it'll be to do with the end of freedom of movement, of lorry parks and lorry drivers not being able to get home for Christmas, stacked up for miles and miles on the M20. I wonder, in those days in the 1980s, before freedom of movement, when they were filling out all those forms, do you think the government of the day went around handing out cereal bars to the lorry drivers as
No,
they
because people at that stage knew it was going to take time
yeah.
to get across the Channel or to get across the North Sea. The scandal about what's happened now is that it is not just about COVID, in my mind. If you've opened Marston Airfield, that was a preparation for Brexit. And what they're trying to do is hide the fact that they knew that there would be a disastrous impact of closing the borders, getting out of the single market. And they've made preparations for that very badly. And the COVID crisis has merely exacerbated that. And I don't think one should really conflate the two, because it's very easy for the media to present it like that. And I think it's very dishonest, because COVID merely shows how bad it is when you've got inadequate border arrangements and you're pretending that it's not going to affect everything, the daily lives of people, and of course it is.
That's absolutely right. I agree with that. But what I wanted to say, I suppose, is that in a sense, we've seen this before. We've seen it in the 1980s when, as you said, people had to fill in 14, lorry drivers had to fill in 14 forms, and it took a long time to get across the Channel. And in a sense, that was what prompted the long journey which you've been describing to us. And all of the work, much of it led by British MEPs and governments of both political colours over a generation and a half or more to get to the point where we are today. And the point we are today is where we have free movement in Europe. But of course, as far as free movement is concerned between the EU and the UK, that is about to end. And so, having lived and been so much a part of not just, as you say, developing free movement, but all of everything that came into the mix, all of the challenges that we had to face because of that, how could we actually arrange ourselves so that the benefits outweighed the challenges that we face? All of that work got done. How do you feel at this moment where, well, one can perhaps imagine how you must feel, but what would you tell us about what your thoughts are, perhaps, as well as your feelings at this moment that Britain is ending free movement with the European Union?
I think there's genuine grief. People really are heartbroken. People set up their own families, their lives, on the basis of no borders. They treated Europe as though it were one country, in effect, in which they could live, love, work. That's the cliche. Within those borders. And I think for young people now to be in a situation where they are locked in to a little island, which is no longer going to participate in the phenomenally influential Erasmus exchange programs, have the freedom of movement to go on stag nights and parties anywhere they wanted, be able to undertake apprenticeships, learn from each other, have more linguistic diversity, is such a myopic approach to take to anything in the world as it is now. It is, in my mind, totally idiotic. And I think the damage will be long lasting. If one looks at 14-year-olds now and one looks at what their prospects are, they're very, very narrow compared to, say, an average 14-year-old in Finland or one in Ireland. And if one looks at younger children, their worlds have shrunk, and they've been deliberately shrunk. And it is like being incarcerated in a world that it was forgotten and a world to which we never wanted to go back. So I think the challenges facing anyone in Britain are huge, and it shouldn't be forgotten just how much damage has been done to people, serious damage. And it wasn't just the fact that, you know, it's very easy to say, oh, the metropolitan elite and those who could travel were the beneficiaries of freedom of movement. They weren't. Everybody benefited hugely. And we changed the way in which our economy was run to just-in-time delivery. We changed the whole way of looking at the world by experience. And people are now going to have an experience which is damaging, parochial, laced with jingoistic nonsense, lots of xenophobia, a media that is not critical and hasn't been critical for donkey's years. Some of them are very ignorant. MPs who are, in some cases, equally ignorant, and a whole world that people who were born after the Second World War, right up till 2 or 3 years ago, enjoyed. All that's gone. For what? To make us poorer? That to me is illogical. And that's the most polite way of putting it. It's illogical and it's ignorant. If it's done for ideology or for any other reason, it is not, to my mind, democratic or legitimate to deliberately impoverish a country unnecessarily. And that's what's my biggest fear for young people at the moment. They're facing an impoverished future. They're not going to be able to benefit from all kinds of initiatives on digital society that's being taken by the EU, on a common health union, on all the innovative research, all the programs that are being developed within the EU by means of having interaction with citizens, the Commission actually asking people, what do you think about this? How should we deal with austerity in future? Should we have a common wage for everybody? And trying to pull ideas in order to make a better world. And the Brits, no, the government shut them out of it. Why?
Yeah, I've certainly lived, loved and worked in Europe and been very, very grateful and appreciative of that opportunity, which started for me as soon as I left university. And I think, you know, perhaps when in those days, a long time ago now, you know, there was just a few of us that had the opportunities. We were very privileged, but I've met so many people along the way over the last 30 years or so from all parts of the UK, all walks of life, all kinds of backgrounds, who for all sorts of reasons have benefited from freedom of movement and who all have their story to tell. And in a sense, that's what Europe is for me, although I've spent a lot of my time politics and academia and talking, you know, about the European Union as you do. As you've just said, it's really what it comes down to is all of those human stories, all of those human connections that have developed and enriched our personal lives, professional lives in many cases, working lives, but you know, the country, I think, and Europe are part of the great kaleidoscope, part of the great tapestry that is Europe today. And I saw on Twitter the other day somebody was saying, you know, they brought the image to mind of the end of the Vietnam War. Not that obviously we want to think of our relation with Europe in a warlike way, although there are people who like to do that, and they're totally irresponsible to do that. But the image was of the helicopter, the last helicopter out of Saigon, and that was a very, very striking image. I wonder, I was actually in Berlin at the time the Berlin Wall came down, a very striking image. I never thought I'd see a time when walls and barriers were going back up again. One wonders what the image will be that stays in people's minds, goes into the history books for this important moment that we're experiencing now. What would be the lorry parks in Dover or what it'll be. But the thing about the helicopter from Saigon was that, you know, you were probably allowed to sort of take one small object with you. I don't know whether you were or you weren't, but one might imagine that you were. And if of all of the things you've been telling us about, Juliet, that have been happening since you won European Woman of the Year in 1992 up to where we are now, 2020, free movement about to come to an end, there was one thing that you could take in your bag as you climb into that helicopter that's going to take you across into this new world of 2021, the end of free movement, and Britain leaving the single market and so on. What would that want, if you were allowed to keep one thing from everything that is being jettisoned on the 31st of December, what would that one thing be?
EU citizenship and freedom, as exemplified by freedom of movement and the Burgundy passport.
Yeah.
You know, the passport is the symbol, isn't it, of EU citizenship? So I would take that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully it'd be a long time before yours expires. And what about
it's gone, hasn't it? It has gone. That's the point. People in Britain are shocked when they get these blacky blue bits of passport. But everything that is associated with the Burgundy passport, the EU citizenship with rights, social rights that you were talking about before, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, that's gone. Everything that made this world of ours a better place, where we could criticise each other and try and improve things for the next generation, that's been jettisoned.
Been devalued in a way, the passport, hasn't it? It's there's a world ranking of nationalities and passports.
Yes.
We've slipped down the league table exactly because we've had these rights that you just described being stripped away, and it devalues the not just the pound in your pocket, but the passport in your pocket as well. So
and it seeks to erase history. It seeks to erase the history of European integration since 1945 and the role that all the states have played together, creating a sense of European solidarity, a sense of togetherness, and a sense that we can do better and we must do better and we dare to do better.
Yeah. By working together, by standing together. And that's a lesson I think the Europeans have learned. And they know that their destinies are intertwined. And so you'll end up with your blue passport, made, of course, in France. What would your message though be to the next generation of young Europeans? What would your advice be to the young Juliet Lodge, who is going to miss out now on European Women of the Year? What would your advice to her be in terms of what needs to happen next going forward?
I'd say dare think of a better world and how you can work together and maintain the links, because this situation cannot persist. And you will become young parents yourselves. You've got to envisage what you want for your own children as well as what you want for yourselves and your parents, and what kind of a Europe you want to be part of. Because at the moment you've been incarcerated and cut adrift. So dare think of something better, dare think of how you want to achieve it, and dare go and do it.
I may say so, inspirational today as it was when I first came across you in 1990. As you know, you've lived in Berlin. I think you know that I've lived in Berlin. I think in the 1960s when the Berlin Wall went up, people hoped that they would see the day when it came down again. They did. And so let us hope in this moment of loss that we mourn of all, not just free movement, but all our rights as EU citizens. Let's hope that we will see the day when we get them back again. Juliet Lodge, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And it's been
Merry Christmas.
Pleasure to talk to you. Merry Christmas. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Okay.